Good evening, everyone. This is the sharing for March 8th, 2025. So we will give continuity to that important topic of the previous week, such as fear, how to overcome fear, how we can impact the approach and relief of this process within us. We have experienced that to some extent, all of us, and we know how uncomfortable it is. As we saw in the previous sharing, those who haven't watched the sharing can watch it. The topic for today, the title for today, to give a continuity to what we saw previously, is how to overcome fear and current steps. Current steps, because this topic is also connected to the evolutionary moment of human consciousness as a whole. And the step that is before us, our next step, individually and as humanity. We have some questions that will help us to deepen into this topic, and we'll then remember some things worked on in the previous sharing. All fears, panic, all these states that sound like an abrupt dissociation that we may experience, they place us in a sense of impotency that is related to the collective subconscious or unconscious, which causes to us a very peculiar situation. The result of this sensation and experience is that we become paralyzed, and then a situation of lack of initiative established in us, or lack of mood to do what is important to us. So I'll read again in a synthesis again what happened in the previous sharing about the topics of the previous month, but they are characterized not only as we described here, but it's important that we take into account. So we saw the fear of the unknown. Then we saw the fear of bodily death through fantasies, memories, images about this kind of situation that we may have witnessed with someone, or maybe when we imagine ourselves participate in this situation of bodily death, the fear of the lack of control of our individual will. It's important that we study this because it's a kind of uncertain situation in our consciousness that makes it very difficult for us to find that inner strength, which was the previous sharing, inner strength as the overcoming of fears, and this fear of lack of control interferes a lot. We have to remember what it refers to individual power and how, as this matures, our understanding before this, as the essence of all this instruction that we have been sharing here, is precisely this premise that our consciousness exists polarized on many levels, and this point of the polarization in one incarnation, which is what we call ego or personality, is this point that tends to imprison our consciousness and creates many situations, as we will remember today also. Then the fear for not overcoming limits. So as we become accustomed to what we already know, to what we can develop, undertake, when we gradually become no longer accustomed to challenges, because overcoming challenges should be something normal, but this fear of not being able to overcome limits. So the fear of the loss of inner faith, and this refers us or reminds us that we are beings that reincarnate. We have memories of many previous situations in which or with which we became disappointed, frustrated, to establish to ourselves unattainable goals, so we become disheartened throughout life times, and this fear of losing faith. Faith is not belief, is not our believing in something. Faith is an innate intuition that we are part of something broader, and this something broader, from this comes a consciousness, a strength for us to advance, mature, evolve along this situation of human condition. Then the fear of spiritual backstep or stepping back, and the fear for, of the stagnation of projects and ideas. We studied this a lot. We studied how greed, pride, the lack of correct proportions place us before the impossibility to give continuity to the situations and life experiences. So the accumulation of this may generate in the consciousness the fear of the stagnation of ideas and projects. Then the fear of judgment, of evidences that we saw, they are associated to our somehow embarking, so to say, into a collective tendency, and we miss that possibility of expressing ourselves in a harmonious way about our point without being pressed or asphyxiated by a collective consciousness without any judgment value, but that removes from us that genuine experience that we might have. Then the fear of falling into an inner abyss that has to do with all the previous fears that we have mentioned, and those situations that emerge that we that give us a very clear impression that we are not following some higher indication from our own consciousness or from the universe, from God, as anyone can understand. So we stay with this fear of falling into this abyss. And as we saw, the restriction of this is caused by our own mind with a trend, the tendency to control the processes and rather than giving a continuity to our evolutionary and transforming power. So as a tendency of crystallization of the mind goes ahead, this fear, it may be a mental interpretation that when we are before the opportunity to overcome something we do not know, the mind creates its fear of losing control, and this feeling of the abyss may emerge. So the fear of the consequences of universal laws will dedicate at a certain point a whole sharing instruction so that we may expand our understanding of what the laws are. Of course, we are not referring to human laws created by human beings, but the laws of nature, laws of evolution. They are laws that bring attributes, values, codes of ethics, not based on the current terrestrial or human condition. They are universal precepts that have always existed and we have always had contact with them, but due to the inherent need of our current evolutionary moment and the need to repeat experiences and to sustain free will regardless of the reference of these laws, at a certain point we may start feeling fear of the consequences of the distancing from these laws, which we perfectly know internally that at a certain moment we have had some intuition, we saw something, but our free will, our human condition, have conditioned our experience into repetition, and this with time may create this kind of fear. Then the fear of the involution of matter or the fear of the deterioration of the bodily of the bodies and the fear of the premature aging. It has to do with the chronology of the earthly existence, our bodily entities, both our physical body and our etheric body. We have talked about it. The Esoteric Glossary is the basis of these sharings. It has the more technical description And our astral body or emotional body and our mental body also become decadent because they have to do with this movement that is so conflictive of the human condition of the third dimension. Inevitably, there is a lack of loss of vitality. As in order to sustain a certain level of balance, we have to deal with many variables. And at a certain point, this kind of fear for the deterioration of matter or the loss of vitality or the premature aging, they may emerge. So we have to learn how to deal with these situations, doing the best we can do, going way beyond what we can do now, and this mobilizes the potential that it goes beyond the one that we are manifesting in the present moment. I'm making a synthesis now. Then the last one is the fear that may emerge from our being with our will pointed to a certain direction, which is initiatives, understandings, and leaving aside or not maintaining the correct proportion with these indications that we receive, which we may call eventually the higher will or the will of the universe, the laws of universal love, the way each one may understand. The fact is that at a certain point, all of us feel a certain fear or a certain intention of reconciling with this which is higher, because we perfectly know that we are tending to our own will to the detriment of our aligning with this higher law, higher will, sorry. And another aspect of the previous sharing, again, a synthesis, the topic of panic, this dissociation, this gradual dissociation that is momentary among our vehicles, among themselves, which causes nebula panic, paralysis of our cohesion, and this is very disturbing because it can mobilize our nervous system and our mental body and astral body. And this physical sensation of this is an abrupt contraction, a compression in our nervous system that may even lead to symptoms, a psychosomatic situation that does not represent a disease in itself, but may indicate that we are going through or facing already before a process of panic. It's very important that we may understand this process. And these panics may generate a sensation of asphyxia, fear of many situations that our minds bring back when we have a very controlling mind, when we are before an open space. The mind interprets this as a threat, as a situation it cannot control. It interprets it as a panic, and this unleashes all this dissociative process that we have talked about before. And the opposite also, this closed space with lack of ventilation, the situation of the nervous system that ends up feeling compressed instead of interpreting it and maintaining the spatial consciousness with a correct relationship between the astral body with the surrounding area, its relationship with the surrounding area. It's a very plastic body in the sense of plasticity of contact is our emotional body. This body interprets in a certain way. The mental body creates a pressure over it, creating phobias, and this may also create a sensation or feeling of panic. And here we'll begin with a question that may help us deepen into this topic. And among these questions, we'll place this topic of the current steps. A detail I will anticipate now is the following. We, up to now, the human race is a mental race that counts on this structure, this process of the ego and the personality as its anchor, so that the soul, this nucleus of ours that reincarnates or among and through the lifetimes may have a nucleus, an anchor here, which are these bodies, which when they become integrated as a personality, they may be dwelt, there may be the higher self or over self may dwell in it. And the process that the human consciousness and humanity as a whole lives indicates or is a thermometer of this evolutionary moment of humanity, of expanding its expression, of being a mental race that is rational, thinking only, in order to become a race that has an interaction with the fourth dimension, the intuitive plane, the direct knowledge, symbolic life. In other words, that we may become able to communicate with this other kind of awakening that is not the mental process, it'll be the intuitive process. So, having this as a starting point, our current step for humanity and for each one of us on different degrees, this is important that each one may see themselves within this process and see their process within this perspective so that they may establish a relationship of how they will trying to expand their awakening. Awakening what? The awakening of realizing that just as life is based only on the satisfaction of our desires and expectations is not possible. This is no longer nourishes our aspiration for something higher and harmonious. Of all the principles that we hear of equality, fraternity, communion with nature, all of this may only happen when our ego it continues to function. We cannot dissolve it. We can change its quality and mechanism of relationship of our so-called individuality, our persona, so that it may interact with the common good. That instead of being oriented to individual interests. So the current step expected for the human race and an awakened being of today is its opening to its over self, to other energies and laws as we have been studying. And this is the part that will gradually remove us from this region, so to say, this environment of conflicts. These conflicted forces find in the ego and personality their nourishment, and they cause all these situations, including fear. So someone asks, so after all, how can we collaborate, observe, and solve, help, so that this mental panic does not establish itself in us? Mental panic, as we have seen, not specifically or directly mental illness, but it may become a mental illness if we do not work correctly on the re-education and reformatting, if we can use this topic, of our mental process. If we insist, as we studied in the previous sharing, of staying fixed on some concepts, ideas, personal conclusions about situations, we do not manage or do not even want to come out of ourselves. Of course, this creates a kind of mental torture, a process of feedback of a fixed idea, and this will compress the bodies that are beneath the mental body, which is the astral body, the etheric body, and the physical body. Within the physical body, the nervous system. In a certain point, this may generate an association or an automatic response of the expressions of our nervous system, and what is working in our mind may become a conflictive nucleus and repetitive nucleus with a life of its own, and from this, a situation of lack of attention when we do not stop to observe how our fixed ideas and prejudice, our obsessive thoughts about one thing or something or someone or one situation, all this gradually dissociates our mental body from reality. And on the other hand, this compresses the lower bodies, and this may generate nilness. It's not a solution, but it's important to understand the mechanism. So what we need to do as a current step is not to control. And as we saw in the previous sharing, one thing is to control, the verb control. And another thing is to overcome, which has a different meaning. In the classical spirituality or in the classical spiritual science, there is a term that we can study in the Esoteric Glossary, which are the initiations. So, from the certain point of view of the evolutionary of the evolution of the human civilization is when our inner world, not the personality, it makes contact with a vibratory voltage through when the moment comes of contacting an expression of the broader universe rather than its current situation. So when our inner world becomes prepared to make contact with this higher voltage, it comes accompanied with knowledge, revelations, which involves the consciousness with a greater responsibility so that it may start making contact with greater realities, and this brings a consequence when it's not artificially created so that the consciousness may expand and it may be a consciousness at the service of the universe rather than a consciousness with greater power or power manipulation, which are different things. So, initiation is the preparation of our consciousness for an expansion of this consciousness, which is not only our minds, so that it gradually may acquire greater control over all those levels that are beneath that level that has been activated or is being activated during an initiation. So, in all times in the previous cycles, previous to 1988, we'll reach this point of the series of deeply studying what happened in 1988 a little more deeply. Until 1988, the individual in a specific case, they would live expansions of consciousness because they were opening paths. It was an experimental situation in humanity to see how the reaction of the human bodies and the material particles of the human beings when they receive the influence from a higher level that was being awakened in a process of expansion of consciousness or initiation. So much so that from 1988 onwards, all of humanity is going through this preparation for an expansion of consciousness, which will be this following step of humanity, a more intuitive humanity with a science that is more interactive with the other kingdoms of nature, something broader and that depends less on human manipulation, but something guided from a universal matrix. So humanity as a whole, is being prepared for this initiation or expansion of consciousness. And naturally, this also causes some pressure over our body vehicles because they feel that we are being invited into an elevation of our consciousness beyond the mental and emotional planes, especially. And this causes some reactions, as we studied in the previous sharing, of what we call the guardians of the threshold, which are our aspects that are addicted to some behaviors that want to prevent the expansion of our consciousness and prevent us from identifying ourselves with our inner worlds. So someone asked, how can we come out of the mental panic? If we can intelligently understand that the process of mental panic is generated by this fixed thought and obsessive thought of crystallized ideas, we avoid this or we come out of this by avoiding to nourish this process that may have gained a life of its own within us, thoughts that may practically work uh, in an independent way. And as we detect this, we'll gradually devitalizing this mechanism. The mechanism becomes devitalized until it ceases to be automatic. It'll start depending on our will and intention. Do you follow me? So if we gradually monitor the mechanism and by being more observing of this process, we may have some keys so that we may, throughout the time, we may unlock this process that generates a mental panic. And eventually, there are situations that we may bring even from previous lives. And take a look at the Esoteric Glossary about permanent atom. We'll study at a certain moment about this more in detail. It's the atom that between one incarnation and the other, it makes a synthesis of a body of ours in one incarnation, and the atom becomes synthesis of that body. And when the soul reincarnates, the lords of karma, devas, angels, an architecture, so to say, coordinates and accompanies an incarnation. It a group it gathers those particles that have the same vibration of that permanent atom so that the individual may restart its evolution from the point it had stopped. Can you follow? So our permanent atom assimilates the synthesis, and in the following incarnation, it gathers atoms from the general reservoir of the planet, see in the glossary, and the particles that will comprise our bodies. So our reincarnatory process starts again through a new incarnation, and our mental body may have traits of this process of mental panic because it may have nourished in a previous life a process of fear. So this may stay in the permanent atom and start again in a in a future lifetime. Someone may say, I do not identify myself with having nourished fixed thoughts, but there may be something in your mental body that may have come from previous lifetimes that they may be so much addicted to this process that it has become a part of yours. This is important that we may understand the topic of the race. We may start an approximation with the lineages. All this will guide, transmute, heal all this human evolution that we have gone through up to now, which has been permeated with many traumas and situations. And connected with what we were studying before, the person says, so as the ego is the one that wants to hold and stop, it's always the ego that wants to stop our evolution. No, sometimes our soul, depending on its degree of awakening, it may also limit the light and knowledge that may come from a level that is above the soul, like the body of light, the monad, or the spirit. The soul is also a nucleus of evolution. It's not our highest level. In our conscious context, yes, the ego tends to withhold evolution because it feels the approximation of an impulse whose essence of life proposal of the levels above the ego is not to live, no longer live for the ego, but on a level of self-giving. And this is very disturbing for the personality when this process does not come with a re-education of the personality. So we cannot destroy something that is a nucleus of ours that anchors our incarnation as the ego or personality, but we can polish it, we can educate it, so to say. And this is very much necessary to sustain the legitimacy of our experience, but let not everything revolve around this. In a healthy way, we may connect with what happens around us. So, what is much more up to date for our ego and personality is that it may know that it's a level among other levels, so that it may find a good relationship with other higher levels. so that it may find a good relationship also with the human part, so that it doesn't no longer limits our evolution, leading us to enter a situation of conflict. Uh, and this is why in this time, the intuitive plane is being encouraged to transcend the human ego, the human condition, and this may indeed cause a kind of impulse that's very different that we must try to understand and collaborate with these reflections in sharings, but we cannot have the ego as an enemy of ours or establish a field battle with our personality. We have to polish it, form it as a kind of living temple. Those bodies or temples that welcome our deeper consciousness so that it may go through many processes of synthesis, purification, and discernment, so that it may become a mirror of the higher levels. And many among us bring residues of previous lifetimes and incarnations in which the processes of extreme asceticism have been worked by ourselves, because in previous cycles, matter was much denser than in the current times. So they some austere measures and extreme measures such as fasting, ceasing to eat, to have an extreme asceticism, so that the bodies might not be nourished, so that they might no longer create a vice. But the human consciousness is much more evolved right now as a whole, so that it's not up to date to maintain an extreme asceticism, but rather that we must polish our consciousness, and as a very up to date step, this love for transcending our human condition, which is the origin of the misery in which we find ourselves, of so much inequality, extreme selfishness, manipulations, fake narratives, deceiving narratives. The ego wants to withhold the level of evolution, but we have to polish the ego, invite it to participate in the evolution, in the process of growth. So our ego as a whole, they may adhere to evolution and have the feeling that they also are evolving. Our ego can evolve, and a first step that is very accessible is to think and understand the need of others, to be more attentive to understand the others, interacting with nature and with the spirit of being harmonious, edifying, and we have to bring our ego into the evolutionary process. Another person asks if tiredness that we have mentioned in a previous sharing, if it's sharing related to electromagnetic vibrations or 5G radiations? No. The tiredness that we have mentioned in a previous sharing is our insistence on living in a way of living or an understanding of life that no longer corresponds to our consciousness. This not corresponding to ourselves, it means it doesn't correspond to our inner world, this highest level that we can call ourselves, our over selves, our inner world identifies a new goal, new goals, new laws, a new way to live, to be, to experience life, to interact, to edify and construct. But if we insist on processes that no longer correspond to the evolutionary moment we should be living, or that our inner world is already living, and as we are not aligned and we do not identify and correspond to this, if we do not identify it, we may have this tiredness of saying, it's enough, I will not insist with this. So we take a step when we really become tired of insisting on something that no longer corresponds to us. This is the sense that this is the sense in which tiredness was mentioned in a previous sharing. Here are some questions. The person asks, if renunciation of the aspects of the ego and self-observation help in the transcendence of fears. Another question is, by observing oneself and observing these fears, can we understand how they work? And what is the next step? How to eliminate or absorb the situation, how to solve it. As we were studying before, we should not have any anxiety or ambition to control this, but we may overcome this and try to understand. And as we understand an attitude that is very difficult in human condition is to observe. We have a tendency of becoming involved with what we are experiencing. This emotional tendency to increase, to expand everything around us, as the emotional body has this characteristic, this plasticity of increasing things, of projecting things around it, around itself, in the surrounding things. So, a way to understand this situation is by observing the processes, not becoming involved with them, and having a deep conviction that our bodies have an intelligence of their own, and we do not count on them, and that many diseases, disturbances, and uneasiness are because of the lack of confidence that that in knowing that our bodies have an intelligence of their own. While we are discussing this, is anyone concerned with the breathing or observing your heart beatings? Of course, no one is controlling their blood pressure. Is anyone attentive to how their nervous system is carrying out their electric impulses? Of course not. So our physical body, which is one of the most developed among the vehicles and bodies we have has an organization of its own that knows how to create a defense to isolate and become defended from a situation that may threaten it. But the emotional body and the mental body interpret and increase that with its illusory images. Someone has a sensation in the chest, they call the hospital, and it was just something. Maybe the person ate too quickly, and the mental body starts creating an imagination in an interpretation and unleashes a symptom that has nothing to do with what is happening. So, this possibility for us to recover this trust in our own material bodies, physical body, etheric body, our emotional and mental body, will even bring us a self-security that is very special, a security, a self-security that even in the face of panic, we'll observe that and allow our bodies to experience that and organize themselves without any extra stimulus of interpretation, control, etc., or retention, or of noticing this fear, hysteria, or that despair. All these are interpretations of our that may have nothing to do with the reality. They may not represent any risk, any real risk for our experience, for our lives. It's an interpretation. So we really have to reconsider our relationship with our bodies and consider them as the environment in which my consciousness will dwell, and we have to keep a continuous vigil, a state of consciousness that's stable and healthy, so that we may learn how these mechanisms work. Some have a life of their own, but we have to polish them. But the process is to deal with this, how to overcome them. We have to start observing ourselves. What is the triggering factor that creates this? And why do I embark on that? Why do I have to nourish that? Is that the real thing that is happening around me? So let's see. In some environments, as the environment of some airplane pilots, in their schools, there are some simulators And in those simulators, there is a mechanism of a mechanic simulation, and the brain interprets that external stimulus as a real situation. But the person, bottom line, knows it's a simulation. But even then, they experience the symptom. Why is that? So we have a mechanism that will respond very automatically sometimes. But if our minds know and they change the proportion of the reality of that situation, it eventually will no longer trigger that fear, panic, memory. It opens a situation in which in psychiatry is called the traumatic window, that in general is very dissipating and wears out and creates despair. But if it continues to happen with us, let's try. Trying does not mean managing, and no, it doesn't mean a frustration if we do not manage it. We'll try again every day, a little bit every day, avoiding those topics that we dealt with in the previous sharing. And when these mechanisms emerge, we may have a little more clarity about distance that we may keep from what is happening so that our intelligence may reorganize itself to avoid a stimulus that might press us, as we have seen, press our nervous system, even with some psychosomatic symptom or a dissociation or an abrupt release of our astral body. And then the physical cells feel unprotected as our bodies are like a layer within one another. So if our astral body becomes released abruptly, our physical body feel vulnerable and they may have this interpretation or sensation of fear. So everything starts with self-observation. Study a previous sharing because we dealt with more details of our attitudes, interpretations, that eventually, when we are unattentive or when we are too much mixed with the collective unconscious, we embark in these reactions as a whole. We are no longer observing and we are interacting and being dragged by something that eventually is not really related to us. We should not connect with that. Well, it's very important that we may see the topic of the human condition. We'll talk about this on a special sharing so that we may first know it, second, accept it, and then, if possible, at a certain moment, love it, however paradoxical it may seem. First, because it's a situation we cannot come out of it unless we disincarnate, and our current evolutionary stage is to evolve along the human condition. This is why I said that those extreme the point in old times was to isolate from any kind of impulse that would nourish the human condition, even if they were necessary for the bodies, so that a new stage of consciousness might be experienced. But our consciousness has evolved so much throughout so many lifetimes. So a current step, an up-to-date step, is to recognize the human condition, to acknowledge the human condition, so that it may evolve, so that our spiritual soul, our awakening of consciousness, may lead our human consciousness to evolve. This is different, isn't it? Different from rejecting and having a clash with this and having an incarnation of conflict in which our body is always considered a problem, my emotions are always considered a problem, my mental thoughts may be considered a problem. It doesn't have to be like that. We are created, we have been created to learn, to coexist with all our levels of consciousness, and to cause our most extreme expression of our life expression in our incarnation to be natural and elevate this human condition to another level. This is why it's important to learn not to fear the human condition, not to fear it is precarious, it is limited by its own constitution. It is addicted to many situations from previous lifetimes, but we are not just that. If we are looking for this kind of instruction and this kind of impulse, we have to remember that our inner world, we have to remember our inner world because that's where clarity comes from, lucidity comes from, so that we may gradually elevate this human condition, polishing this human condition, and loving this human condition, because this is the anchor that allows us to be here. And why have this as an environment of conflict, of clash, of denial? There are some people who deny food for their bodies. Who has said that this is important? Why denying a rational thought in correct proportions to mature duality in us, to reach a synthesis and have a process prepared for the next step, which is intuition? Who says that we should deny our human condition? We have to understand it, love it, help it to overcome itself, and see this in this a service on our planet in which we on it we are incarnated. And if we could see the process of incarnation as an opportunity to, as we were saying, to deactivate, to gradually deactivate or balance or weaken this movement, this tendency of the ego to create around it everything that it sees, everything it feels, everything it thinks, and to have its own perspective. In other words, we have to cease to do that and start an altruistic, a selfless attitude for nature, and that we may put ourselves in this intention to serve. And this gradually deactivates many mechanisms, which, if we do not deactivate them, they will continue to nourish this vicious circle of the subconscious and unconscious and the mental processes that gradually encapsulate and imprison our consciousness. Well, and a key the person asks, a key, an impulse, a suggestion is that we may have a positive attitude. A positive attitude is not an attitude that of the imagination or an attitude without foundation. It is our in our quest for self-knowledge, being optimistic that we really can contact our higher level, this nucleus of ours that has a little more clarity about all this, to be optimistic, this motivation to evolve, this motivation to think of others, this motivation to take care of and love nature, all of this gradually deactivate these environments, these spaces that are imprisoned by selfishness, and that bring to our consciousness a sensation of being hijacked by selfishness, and we perceive that they are dark without horizons. So, this positive attitude is a key for us to solve all this situation. This has nothing to do with our being perfect, our being absolutely precise. No, we are here to evolve. If we accept our current moment, this is the starting point, so that from this point we may evolve. Whatever point it is, it's a starting point for evolution. Whatever moment we are going through, whatever situation we're going through, whatever state of consciousness we have, whatever interpretation of ourselves we may have created for ourselves or someone has created about us, this is the starting point for us to evolve. And in this simplicity, this gratitude for this situation, but how to be thankful for a difficult situation, because it is indicating to us what we have to work on. But so we have to thank. We enter with gratitude and this intention to accept the situation, not in a submissive, passive, or defeatist way, but as a starting point from which we'll start a new trajectory. And this is very encouraging. But we have to be transparent as we saw in the previous sharing, to be honest with ourselves and ask ourselves, what do I want to live? What experience do I identify for myself? And as we identify this, to place our will, and this will gradually gather all the conditions for gradually having all this balanced and concretized. And as we gradually awaken from this lethargic process of panic, fear, frustration, the despair, these these paralysis gradually create a dark space for us. We have to awaken from this and once again make the decision to seek for this life that is within us, and gradually in this self-giving we may start reestablishing an alignment with what we call our inner world, and then we'll be helped to come out of these situations. Okay, very well. It's an important topic for all of us. We have some steps, current steps for us and for humanity and the planet at this moment that we are going through. So if there's any question, you can put on the chat of our transmission, and in the coming sharings, we'll respond and expand considering your situations. Very well. So a good work for all of you with self-esteem, and recover the self-esteem. But how I am in such a miserable situation, how can you talk about self-esteem? Listen, our situation, whatever it is, if we really aspire to come out of this place and to see correctly in our inner world and to make silence and start deepening into this connection with our inner world, we'll come out of this. Let's trust we'll really come out of this and we'll be deeply helped. Okay, so good night. Thank you very much, and we meet on the next sharing.